Hello, my name is Jamila Arrington, and I chose to do my presentation on child abuse and neglect, focusing on rural communities. Abusive behavior comes in many forms, but the common denominator is the emotional effect on the child. Whether the abuse is a slap, a harsh comment, stony silence, or not knowing if there will be dinner on the table, the end result is a child that feels unsafe, uncared for, and alone. Let's take a look at what child abuse and neglect really is. Child abuse is the deliberate infliction of pain and suffering on children. It's not accidental and it can be physical, sexual, or emotional mistreatment. Neglect is the failure to furnish proper shelter, provide nourishment, provide medical treatment, lack of emotional support, and the state of being uncared for. What can cause child abuse and neglect? First, we will look at intergenerational transmission of violence. Many children learn violent behaviors from their parents and then grow up to abuse their own children. Thus, the abusive behavior is transmitted across generations. Studies show that some 30% of abused children become abusive parents, whereas only 2 to 3% of all individuals become abusive parents. Children who experience abuse and violence may adopt this behavior as a model for their own parenting. Next is social stress. Stress brought on by a variety of social conditions raises the risk of child abuse within a family. These conditions include unemployment, illness, poor housing conditions, a larger than average family size, the presence of a new baby or disabled person in the home, and the death of a family member. A large majority of reported cases of child abuse come from families living in poverty. Social, isolation and low community involvement is where parents and caretakers who abuse children tend to be socially isolated. Few violent parents belong to any community organizations, and most have little contact with friends or relatives. This lack of social involvement deprives abusive parents of support systems that will help them better deal with social or family stress. And lastly is family structure. Certain types of families have an increased risk of child abuse and neglect. However, single parent families usually earn money less than other families, so this may account for the increased risk of abuse. Families with chronic and marital discord or spousal abuse have higher rates of child abuse than families without these problems. Contrary to some people's beliefs, words can hurt and emotional abuse can severely damage a child's mental health or social development. Examples of, well, not examples, but signs that a child is being emotionally abused include withdrawn or anxiousness, extreme or inappropriate behavior, disconnection to the parent or caregiver, and acts inappropriately adult for their age or inappropriately infantile. And an example of acting inappropriately infantile would be a child who is older that is still wet in the bed. Physical abuse involves physical harm or injury to the child. It may be the result of a deliberate attempt to hurt the child or excessive physical punishment. Signs that a child is being physically abused include frequent injuries or unexplained bruises. They're always alert or waiting for bad things to happen. Injuries that have patterns like a belt, a hand, or other objects. They tend to shy away from touch and they flinch, and they wear inappropriate clothing to cover up injuries. For example, long sleeves on hot days. Child sexual abuse is an especially complicated form of abuse because of its layers of guilt and shame. It's important to recognize that sexual abuse doesn't always involve body contact. Exposing a child to sexual situations or material is sexually abusive, whether or not touching is involved. Signs that a child is being sexually abused include trouble walking or sitting. They display knowledge and sexual acts inappropriate to their age. They have strong efforts to avoid a specific person without an obvious reason. They don't want to change their clothes in front of others or participate in physical activities. They have an STD or pregnancy, and they oftentimes run away from home. Child neglect is a very common type of child abuse. It is a pattern of failing to provide for a child's basic needs. Sometimes a parent might become physically or mentally unable to care for a child, such as with a serious injury, untreated depression, or anxiety. Signs that a child is being neglected are clothes are ill-fitting, filthy or inappropriate for the weather. They hoard food because they do not know when their next meal would be. Their hygiene is consistently bad. They have untreated illnesses and physical injuries. They are frequently unsupervised or left alone or allowed to play in unsafe situations, and they are frequently late or missing from school. Psychological short-term effects of child abuse include low self-esteem, depression, emotional disconnection, anxiety disorders, distrust, and self-fulfillment prophecies. Psychological long-term effects include domestic violence, alcohol and drug abuse, mental illness. They have learning and cognitive disorders, and that is where the child does not show the abilities and skills normally found in other children the same age, such as starting to talk or socialize with others. Some children regress, which means they slip backwards, losing skills they had before. Behavioral dysfunction. Maltreatment in late childhood and adolescence has been linked to antisocial behavior in adulthood. In adulthood. They can have self-injuries or result in suicide or death. They have developmental delays, and they also have social problems. Next, we will be talking about child abuse and neglect in rural areas. Rural communities face a number of challenges such as poverty, substance abuse, unemployment, and lower levels of education. These challenges are particularly concerning because they are strongly linked to child maltreatment. The fourth National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect found that children in rural areas had higher incident rates of maltreatment than children in urban and major urban areas in nearly every category of maltreatment and level of severity. More than 60% of caregivers in rural America with a report of child maltreatment experience high family stress compared with 50% in urban areas. Nearly 1 in 3 rural families reported to Child Protective Services have trouble meeting basic financial needs compared with just over 1 in 5 urban families reported to CPS. For rural families, isolation and lack of adequate services to help cope may present formidable obstacles to healthy family life. Rural emergency departments have fewer resources than urban emergency departments for the management of child abuse. In rural areas, services to treat maltreated children are lacking, and even fewer preventive services are available for at-risk children. In rural communities, child abuse or neglect is often underreported due to factors such as isolation and geographic remoteness, lack of social services or other support programs, lack of or limited foster care or emergency housing, and social stigma for survivors. Next, we will talk about the programs and policies for child abuse and neglect. First, we have the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. The purpose of this act was to provide financial assistance for a demonstration program for the prevention, identification, and treatment of child abuse and neglect. Some of the main provisions of this act is that it provided assistance to states to develop child abuse and neglect identification and prevention programs, and it authorized limited government research into child abuse prevention and treatment. The next one is the Child Abuse Prevention, Adoption, and Family Services Act of 1988. The purpose of this act was to amend the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment and Adoption Reform Act, and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. Some of the main provisions of this act, it broadened the scope of research to include investigative and judicial procedures applicable to child abuse cases and the national incidence of child abuse and neglect. It established a national data collection system to include standardized tests on false, unfounded, or unsubstantiated cases and the number of deaths due to child abuse and neglect. It expanded the Adoption Opportunities Program to increase the number of minority children placed in adopted families with an emphasis on recruitment and of placement with minority families. Next is the Promoting Safe and Stable Families Amendments of 2001. The purpose of this was to extend and amend the Promoting Safe and Stable Families program, provide new authority to support programs for mentoring children of incarcerated parents, and amend the Foster Care Independent Living Program for educational and training vouchers for youth aging out of foster care. Some of the main provisions of this act is that it amended the definition of family preservation services to include infant safe haven programs. It added strengthening parental relationships and promoting health marriages to the list of allowable activities. It created a matching grant program to support mentoring networks for children of prisoners. It reauthorized funds for the Court Improvement Program. It authorized a voucher program as part of the John H. Chaffee Foster Care Independence Program to provide for education and training, including post-secondary training and education to youth who have aged out of foster care. And lastly is the Safe and Timely Interstate Placement of Foster Care Act of 2006. The purpose of this act was to improve protections for children and to hold states accountable for the safe and timely placement of children across state lines. It increased the required frequency of state caseworker visits for children in and out of state foster care placements without imposing restrictions on either state's ability to contract with a private agency to perform those visits. I found two of the main weaknesses of child welfare policies, and one is the conflicting application of the law and failure to include the views of children, and the second one was untrained judges who are unaware of the child welfare policies and laws. Our plan for advocacy first includes building community awareness and conscientization. Conscientization builds awareness of an issue and mobilizes the desire to respond and take action based on available resources. Once we do this, we can transform individual and community attitudes, which ensure that socio-cultural traditions and behavior are more protective for our children. And also, communities will stop harming traditional practices, replacing them with widely practiced positive protective practices. Next is to establish and strengthen reporting and referral mechanisms. It is vital to establish and strengthen effective channels for reporting incidents of child abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Reporting suspected child abuse and neglect or exploitation makes it possible for the child and family to get help. Once we do this, Effective and safe mechanisms established for children or adults to report abuse, neglect, or exploitation of the children. The mechanism should link informal and formal mechanisms appropriately. Next is to provide quality support to vulnerable families. While all families may need some help, each community has families either with particularly complex needs or that are particularly vulnerable to abusive or exploitive situations. At-risk households are supported by early intervention and local support to prevent neglect, abuse, and exploitation. Lastly, is to build life skills and resilience to protect children. Children are a key part of the informal and sometimes formal elements of the system and have a role to play in their own protection and the protection of others. Once we do this, we can increase the resilience of children, especially the most vulnerable. Vulnerable children's voices are credible and heard to influence policy and decisions that affect their well-being. And children, especially the most vulnerable, develop and apply skills to protect themselves. Recommendations for change include some recommendations for change are to strengthen economic supports to families, change social norms to support parents and positive parenting, provide quality care and education in life, enhance parenting skills to promote a healthy child development, intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk. That is the end of my presentation, and here are some references. But first, I wanted to discuss how social workers can help and change child abuse and neglect. We can allocate increased resources to support community-based child abuse prevention activities through the full funding and quick reauthorization of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. We can promote professional involvement in child protection. We can expand school health education programs to include mental health education and a curriculum that focuses on parenting and child development to prevent child abuse and neglect. We can build on programs serving children and families to offer a variety of child maltreatment prevention services, and support efforts to address the importance of culturally competent, appropriate services for children and families. Thank you.